The letters were right there for 42 years. Carved in limestone. Sitting in the Licking County Memorial Gardens, row 14, plot 7, underneath a small carved dove, and the words, "Beloved teacher, beloved daughter." Visitors walked past on Sunday afternoons. Groundskeepers mowed around the base of it every week from April through October. Birds rested on the edge of it in summer, and snow collected in the carved grooves of it every January. And not once in 4 decades did anyone stop and read what Carol Ann Merritt had left behind in those letters. Not once did anyone understand that she had done the one thing a woman who knows she is going to die can do. She had told the truth without telling anyone at all, and it would take 42 years, a retired schoolteacher, and a moment of quiet grief on a Tuesday afternoon to finally pull the secret out of the stone. But to understand what Carol Ann left behind, you first have to understand who she was. And to understand who she was, you have to go back to Granville, Ohio in the summer of 1980, when none of this had happened yet. Granville was the kind of small Ohio town that looked like someone had painted it from memory of a better time. Population just over 4,000, tucked into Licking County in the rolling terrain of central Ohio, where the farmland begins to give way to small college hills. It had a single main street with red brick storefronts and a hardware store that had been there since 1923. Denison University sat on the hill above town, and on fall Friday nights the whole community came out for the Granville Blue Aces, and the smell of popcorn and cut grass would drift down from the stadium and across the neighborhoods below, and people would sit on their front porches and listen to the crowd and feel entirely satisfied with where they were. Carol Ann Merritt had grown up in that town. She was 31 years old in the fall of 1981, which meant she had been a Granville girl since the Eisenhower administration, since station wagons and rotary phones, and the era when parents told their children to be home when the streetlights came on, without ever worrying that they wouldn't be. She had gone to Granville High School. She had come back after college and taken a job teaching 4th grade at Welsh Hills Elementary, and in the 5 years she had been there, she had accumulated a reputation of the kind that small towns build slowly and mean completely. The parents of her students talked about her in grocery store lines. The principal had mentioned her name twice in his end-of-year address. She was the kind of teacher children still wrote letters to when they were adults. Her mother, Patricia Merritt, lived 4 blocks away in the house Carol Ann had grown up in, a cream-colored 2-story with a vegetable garden along the south fence that Patricia tended obsessively and Carol Ann helped with on Sunday mornings. They spoke on the phone every evening. This was not unusual for that era and that place. This was simply what families did. Carol Ann had a habit that everyone who knew her knew. She kept a small spiral notebook in her coat pocket, the kind sold in drugstore bins for 49 cents, and she wrote things down. Grocery lists, lesson plans, things she wanted to remember. Her colleague Margaret Fowler, who taught 3rd grade next door at Welsh Hills, and who would spend the next 20 years trying to get someone to listen to her, later described it to investigators this way. Carol always said, "If something matters, write it down. Write it down so it can't be forgotten." Nobody understood how precisely she had lived by that belief until it was too late. The autumn of 1981 was beautiful in the way Ohio autumns can be. The maples going amber and rust across the hills around Granville, the air carrying the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. Carol Ann walked to work most mornings. The distance from her house on Granger Street to Welsh Hills Elementary was just under a mile, and she had made that walk hundreds of times. She knew every sidewalk crack and every barking dog on the route. She knew which houses left their porch lights on and which ones had been for sale since spring. That was the last normal thing anyone would say about Carol Ann Merritt for a long time. that she walked to work in the autumn, that she kept her notebook in her pocket, that she was the kind of teacher children remembered and the kind of daughter who called every evening. On the morning of March 4th, 1982, she did not arrive at Welsh Hills Elementary. By 9 o'clock, Margaret Fowler was covering her class. By 10, the principal had called Patricia. By noon, Patricia Merritt had walked every block of the route between Granger Street and the school 3 times. The notebook was found on a Wednesday morning. It was sitting on Carol Ann's kitchen table, open to a blank page. She had left without it, which Margaret would later say she had never done. Not once in 5 years. The investigation was led by Licking County Sheriff's Deputy Clarence Holt, a methodical man who had been with the department for 11 years, and who approached the case with the seriousness it deserved from the very first day. Records from the original case file show that Holt worked the disappearance of Carol Ann Merritt for 16 months without a pause. He interviewed 47 people. He followed 7 separate leads. He requested assistance from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Columbus, and 2 agents came to Granville in the spring of 1982 and spent 3 weeks there before concluding that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone with anything. Patricia Merritt did not accept that conclusion. She stood on her front porch when Deputy Holt came to deliver it, and she listened very quietly, and then she said, "That man was in her life. I know it." She did not name a name. She may not have had one yet. But she was right, and the investigation would not prove it, and that gap between knowing and proving would consume the next 4 decades. The early suspects were 2, a man named Douglas Renner, who had been seen arguing with Carol Ann in a parking lot 6 weeks before she disappeared. Records show he was a former student of Denison University, who had briefly dated Carol Ann in the winter of 1980, and an unnamed male neighbor whose schedule Holt noted as suspicious. Renner was interviewed 3 times. He had an alibi for the morning of March 4th, corroborated by 2 co-workers and a gas station receipt from Cossocton, 30 miles away. He was eliminated. The neighbor was looked at, and then not looked at again, and the reason for that would not become clear for a very long time. Carol Ann's body was found in early April of 1982 in a wooded area off Welsh Hills Road, less than a mile from the school she had walked to every morning. The medical examiner's report confirmed she had been killed, though the county kept the specific circumstances restricted. Her mother was permitted to arrange the burial. A headstone was ordered. And Patricia Merritt, a woman who had been told by the authorities that they were doing everything they could, asked for one thing in the design. She asked that the stone include the words that Carol Ann had lived by, the words that Margaret Fowler had quoted to investigators, the words from Carol Ann's own philosophy. Write it down so it can't be forgotten. The stonecutter, a man named Gerald Amos who had run the monument shop on Newark Road for 30 years, carved what Patricia brought him. He did not ask questions. He was not a curious man. He carved letters for a living, and he carved these, and the stone was set in Licking County Memorial Gardens in June of 1982, and the case of Carol Ann Merritt remained officially unsolved. By 1987, 5 years had passed. Deputy Holt had been promoted to detective, and the Merritt file sat in a cabinet in his office, and he looked at it sometimes, but he could not add to it. By 1992, 10 years, Holt had left the department to care for his ailing father, and no one had assigned the case to anyone else. Margaret Fowler had retired from Welsh Hills Elementary, and she sent letters to the sheriff's department twice a year asking about the case, and twice a year she received letters back that said the investigation was ongoing and that new leads were always being pursued. She did not believe this, but she kept writing. By 1998, 16 years after Carol Ann had not arrived at school, Patricia Merritt was 73 years old and in declining health, and she sat in the cream-colored house on her street in Granville, and she kept the phone in her lap in the evenings the way she always had, as if she were still waiting for Carol Ann to call. Patricia died in 2003. She did not know who had killed her daughter. She had never stopped believing she knew which direction the truth lived in, but she had not been able to name it, and neither had anyone else, and the limestone stone in row 14, plot 7, sat through 21 more Ohio winters without saying anything that anyone could hear. The world changes around the unsolved. The children who had been in Carol Ann's 4th grade class were adults by then, parents themselves, some of them grandparents. The hardware store on Granville's main street had changed hands twice. Welsh Hills Elementary had been renovated, the old classroom wing demolished and rebuilt. Margaret Fowler was 81 years old and living in a retirement community in Newark, Ohio, 20 minutes from Granville, and she still talked about Carol Ann to anyone who would listen. The reward poster that had once been in the window of the Granville diner had been gone for more than 30 years. But Margaret had kept a copy. Laminated, in the drawer of her bedside table. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, interviewing, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Carol Ann. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September of 2024 when Margaret Fowler visited the cemetery. She went 4 times a year, as she had since 1982. She brought a small bunch of whatever was available at the Kroger florist, zinnias in summer, mums in fall, and she placed them at the base of the stone, and she talked to Carol Ann for a while the way you talk to someone you have not forgotten. On this particular Tuesday, there were orange chrysanthemums. The afternoon was cool and clear, and Margaret, who was 81 years old and had been a schoolteacher for 32 years, and who had more patience than most institutions, sat down on the small folding stool she brought for these visits and looked at the stone the way she had looked at it 100 times before. Carol Ann Merritt, born September 14, 1950, died 1982. Beloved teacher, beloved daughter. Write it down so it can't be forgotten. And then, Margaret did something she had never done before in 42 years of visits. She took out a pen and a piece of paper from her coat pocket. She had been a schoolteacher, and teachers carry pens the way other people carry keys, and she wrote down the inscription exactly as it appeared. Not to remember it, she had it memorized. But she had been to a church puzzle event the week before, an acrostic game that her friend Helen had organized for the seniors group, and something about the rhythm of the words on the stone had nagged at her since she first sat down. She looked at what she had written. Write it down so it can't be forgotten. The first letter of each word, W. I, D, S, I, C, B, F, she stared. She crossed out the letters that didn't resolve into anything. She looked at the full inscription again. The name, the dates, the epitaph, all of it together. She called her nephew that evening. He was a retired teacher himself and had a careful, methodical mind, and she read him everything on the stone over the phone, letter by letter, and they worked through it together for 2 hours. And when they arrived at what was there, Margaret Fowler sat very still in her chair for a long moment. The first letter of each word of the epitaph, read downward in the order they appeared on the stone, spelled a name. A specific name. 6 letters. A name that Margaret knew. A name that had been in Carol Ann's life. I kept saying to myself, Margaret would tell the Licking County cold case investigators later that Carol was a teacher. She taught children that words have structure. That structure has meaning. And she told me herself, if something matters, write it down. I think she wrote it down. I think she did exactly what she always said. The man whose name was encoded in that stone was Raymond Earl Cusick. He had been a neighbor. He had been, according to the original case file, one of the names that Deputy Clarence Holt had noted as possibly worth a second look, and then had not looked at again. He had been a quiet man, well regarded in Granville, active in the Kiwanis Club, married with 2 children. He had moved to Columbus in 1984 and died there in 2011 at the age of 77. He had never been charged with anything. He had never, as far as the record showed, been interviewed by anyone about Carol Ann Merritt after the initial neighborhood canvass in 1982. The Licking County Sheriff's Office assigned the case to their cold case unit in November of 2024. The lead investigator, Detective Angela Price, went back to the original evidence that had been preserved in storage for 4 decades. There was not much, but there was something. A fiber sample collected in 1982 from Carol Ann's coat. Court documents confirm that when investigators applied modern forensic analysis to the original evidence and cross-referenced it against records obtained through a legal process involving Cusick's surviving family members, a connection was established that could not be explained by coincidence. Raymond Earl Cusick, the man who had been a neighbor, the man who had waved from his driveway and attended neighborhood block parties and been described in the original canvas as cooperative and without apparent connection to the case. The man whose name Carol Ann Merritt had carved, in the only way she could, into the stone where she knew someone would eventually come to look. Records show that investigators also found in Carol Ann's personal papers that had been kept by her mother and then passed to a cousin after Patricia's death, the spiral notebook, not the one found on the kitchen table, but an older one, from the fall of 1981. The entries are not graphic. They are precise, the way a school teacher is precise. A record of incidents. Dates, what was said, what was done. What Carol Ann had been afraid to tell anyone directly, for reasons that the investigators who read the notebook understood immediately. She had written it down. She had always written it down. She knew. Detective Price said in a statement released by the Licking County Sheriff's Office in February of 2025. She knew, and she left us a map that nobody could read until someone thought to look. Raymond Cusick died in Columbus in 2011. He was buried in Franklin County. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. The legal outcome was, in the formal sense, nothing. But the Licking County Prosecutor's Office issued a formal statement in March of 2025, naming Raymond Earl Cusick as the individual responsible for the death of Carol Ann Merritt on or around March 4, 1982. The case was formally closed. The file was closed. The mayor of Granville issued a statement. Welsh Hills Elementary, now a different building but the same name, displayed a photograph of Carol Ann in the front hallway. Margaret Fowler was there for the ceremony, sitting in the front row, wearing a yellow blouse that she said had been Carol Ann's favorite color. Carol Ann Merritt was 31 years old when she died. She had been teaching 4th grade for 5 years. She had walked to work every morning through the maple-lined streets of a small Ohio town where everyone knew everyone and children walked alone without fear. She had kept a notebook in her coat pocket, 49 cents from a drugstore bin, because she believed that if something mattered, you wrote it down. She had a mother who called every evening. She had a colleague who never stopped writing letters. She had a vocabulary for the truth that outlasted the truth's ability to be spoken. She left a message carved in stone. She trusted that someone, someday, would be paying close enough attention. She was right about that, as it turned out. She was right, and it took 42 years. And it took an 81-year-old woman with a pen in her coat pocket and a folding stool and orange chrysanthemums from the Kroger florist. And it took everything that Carol Ann had always believed about words and structure and the simple act of writing things down. But the truth, as it always does, eventually found its way out. There is something to sit with in this story that extends beyond the facts of it. Carol Ann Merritt lived in a time and a place where a woman who knew what she knew had very few ways to make herself heard. She could not have predicted the forensic tools that would eventually confirm what she had written. She could not have known that Margaret Fowler would sit in that cemetery 42 years later with a piece of paper and a pen. What she knew was only this, that words, carefully placed, endure, that stone endures. That a teacher who spent her life believing in the power of structure and language would use structure and language to say the one thing she could not say out loud, and that she was right to believe that someone would eventually read it. A few questions worth thinking about. Does the formal statement from the prosecutor's office, naming Cusick without a trial, without conviction, feel like justice to you? What does this case say about the women who knew dangerous things in that era and had no safe way to report them? And if Carol Ann did encode that name deliberately, what does it tell us about the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at first glance? Justice found Carol Ann Merritt after 42 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.